I had been to Pisgah National Forest a handful of times before that October in 2019, but always on marked trails or with friends who knew the area well. Volunteering for trail maintenance sounded like a good way to get a few days outside before the cold set in. Most of us met for the first time at the trailhead off the Blue Ridge Parkway. We loaded tools into our packs, checked tents, and followed the crew leader down 3 miles of switchbacks to an old, unmarked logging road where we would camp. It wasn't an official site, just a flat enough patch near the junction of 2 fading tracks. The old road ran straight into a wall of rhododendron and undergrowth the color of wet copper. The leader mentioned that there were scattered pits from the logging days just out of view. He said the ground could drop out without warning, so we shouldn't wander after dark. He said it casually, but in a way that stuck. By the time we reached the clearing, the fog was already collecting between the trunks. It carried the smell of cold stone and damp leaves. We set our tents around the main fire ring, a wide circle of ash from previous crews. The forest around us seemed to drink in the remaining light. Even in daylight, the trees crowded close, straight and dark, like a wall that had grown up around the clearing. I remember thinking that the old logging road looked unnatural, almost surgical, the way it cut a clean line into the woods before dissolving into thickets. The evening moved in fast. October light falls early in the mountains, and by 6:30 the sky had a faded metallic tone. The crew leader reminded us again not to wander. He pointed his headlamp down the old road and said the pits were somewhere off to the right, hidden under layers of leaves and vines. No one joked about the warning, which surprised me. Everyone had been upbeat earlier, passing tools around, teasing one another about oversized packs. Once that reminder landed, the conversation dropped into a quieter rhythm. It felt like we all became aware of how the fog muffled our voices. The rest of the night had the usual routine: boil water, eat, talk softly until the cold pushed us toward our tents. My sleeping bag felt clammy from the air, but I drifted off sometime after 10. The forest had the heavy silence that only comes at high elevation. No insects, no traffic hum, just long stretches of nothing punctuated by small, uncertain sounds, the kind that could be branches shifting or something heavier stepping at a distance. I told myself it was deer. I woke abruptly around 2 in the morning. There was no reason for it, no dream I could remember. My first thought was that I had to readjust my sleeping pad, but before I moved, I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It was spoken in a calm, almost everyday tone, as if someone from our group had walked up to the tent to ask a small favor. I froze, waiting to hear it again, thinking maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard the same voice ask me to come over for a moment. No urgency, no emotion. I unzipped the tent quietly and leaned out. The fog had thickened so much that the trees nearest the clearing looked like silhouettes brushed with a dim glaze of moonlight. About 50 yards away, along the old road, a faint headlamp beam drifted through the mist. It didn't move like someone walking. It hovered and shifted slightly, like it was held in a loose grip or pointed without care. My first thought was that one of the guys from our group needed help. Maybe had twisted an ankle walking to relieve himself. Then I remembered that none of us had spare headlamps. We had joked about dying batteries before bed. Everyone had been trying to conserve power. I waited for the sound of boots on leaves, anything to match the distant light. Instead, I heard the voice again, but it didn't line up with the distance. It felt as though the words were right at my ear, not in front of me. The tone still matched the guy I thought it belonged to, but the placement didn't. The beam of the headlamp stayed far away. The voice felt close enough that it triggered the same instinct as someone leaning over my shoulder. I ducked back inside, zipped the tent, and forced myself to lie still. I didn't rustle my bag or shift my weight. I kept my breathing small and slow. I listened for footsteps, for the scraping of a boot on the road, for the crunch of leaves. Nothing came. After a while, I stopped trying to separate real sounds from imagined ones. Everything outside blended into a single murmur, like the forest had settled into a deep, indifferent stillness. At some point, without knowing when, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When I woke again, the sky had begun to brighten. The tent walls glowed faintly with early light, and I could hear someone at the fire pit stirring coals. Morning brought a feeling of relief that felt heavy rather than hopeful. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It felt fragile somehow, like speaking about it before I understood it would make it less believable. We packed up camp and prepared to walk out along the logging road toward the maintained trail. The fog was still thin on the ground, but the forest had regained its usual sound: far-off birds, the scrape of boots, the rustle of packs being adjusted. Then someone called out that there were footprints on the road. All of us gathered around them. They were fresh, sharp-edged, pressed into the long strip of damp soil running down the center of the old road. The prints were from boots, not sneakers, with a tread pattern none of us recognized. We compared them to our own out of curiosity, then with a flicker of concern. They didn't match any of ours. They weren't distorted the way prints sometimes get in soft mud. They were clean, deep, and headed in a straight line from the direction of our camp toward the overgrown section where the road disappeared into thickets. The crew leader followed the tracks a short distance and then stopped. The prints ended where the undergrowth thickened into a wall of vines and briars. The ground sloped down sharply beyond that point. He didn't tell us to look closer. He didn't step closer himself. He just said that it was one of the spots he had warned us about. The leaf litter disguised where the soil gave way to a steep drop. He didn't want anyone near the edge. We stood there longer than we needed to, staring at the last print. It pointed straight toward the slope, as if the person had walked with complete confidence until the moment the ground vanished beneath them. The forest beyond the slope looked like a hollow, a place where cold collected and nothing grew right. No one suggested investigating further. As we hiked back toward the maintained trail, the crew leader walked near me and said the old logging roads were rarely used now, except by hunters or people passing through from private property on the far side of the ridge. He said he had seen tracks before, sometimes days old, sometimes just a few hours. He didn't treat it like a mystery. To him, someone passing through was the simplest explanation, but I noticed he checked the tree line more often than before, as if trying to place a shape or a shadow that wasn't there now, but might have been earlier. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun had burned off most of the fog. The day looked ordinary again, wide and open, nothing like the compressed world of the clearing. We turned in our tools, said our goodbyes, and headed to our cars. I waited until I was alone in mine before sitting still for a long moment, hands on the wheel, trying to make sense of the night. It took me a few days to accept the most straightforward explanation. Someone had been moving along the old road after dark, probably heading toward or away from a hunting spot. Maybe they saw our camp and stayed back, unsure of who we were. Maybe they called out, thinking someone was awake. Maybe the voice sounded close because the fog carried sound strangely in that hollow. Maybe the headlamp beam drifted because the person wasn't walking toward me at all, just shifting their arm while looking for the trail. The footprints ending at the slope bothered me for longer, but even that had a practical answer. The ground near those pits was unstable. A person could have stepped onto firmer soil beyond the initial drop, out of our line of sight, or clung to the brush while moving past. Just because we couldn't see the continuation didn't mean it wasn't there. And the abrupt ending looked sharper because the mud closer to the edge was drier and covered with new leaves. Everything fit within the boundaries of ordinary human behavior once I forced myself to see it that way. No impossible steps. No unknown presence. Just the reality of the forest. Sound traveling strangely, visibility shifting with the fog, and the knowledge that other people sometimes move through remote places without announcing themselves. That explanation settled things for me, not by erasing the unease, but by grounding it. I still think about the moment I heard my name, the feeling that the voice was next to me rather than ahead of me, but I remind myself that fear distorts distance and direction. The forest was thick, the fog dense, and I was half asleep. My mind did the rest. I haven't returned to that stretch of Pisgah since, but not because I believe anything unnatural happened. The place simply left its imprint. It reminded me how easily the familiar can slip into uncertainty in the right conditions, and how much the mind fills in when sight and sound are unreliable. Everything that happened that night had an explanation, and accepting that made the memory clearer, not softer. It remains one of the most vivid experiences I've had outdoors, not because it broke the laws of the world, but because it reminded me exactly how those laws feel when you brush against their edges. In July 2022, I spent a night alone in a lean-to shelter just off the Northville, Placid Trail in the Adirondacks. I had stopped there mostly out of laziness. The humidity that day had been the kind that clung to my skin no matter how slowly I walked, and by early evening my shirt felt more like a wet towel than clothing. I had planned to push another few miles, but when I saw the shelter tucked between the pines near a small stream, the thought of dropping my pack and lying still felt too tempting to pass up. The mosquitoes had been out in force since mid-afternoon, drifting in loose clouds around my head net, tapping against the mesh like impatient fingers. At dusk their whining ramped up to a piercing density, so loud that it felt like a pressure on my eardrums. I ate a quick dinner, brushed my teeth at the edge of the stream, and retreated inside with earplugs ready. Even with the earplugs in, I could still sense the drone of insects vibrating faintly through the air. The damp heat lay over everything like a heavy blanket, and the boards under my sleeping bag were warm from the day's sun. I lay on my back for a long time, not fully asleep, but drifting in that in-between state where thoughts slide into dreams without warning. When I finally did slip under, it was sudden and deep. I woke around 1:30 a.m. without understanding what had pulled me out of sleep. My eyes opened to total darkness. For a moment I thought my headlamp had failed or I had gone blind, but then I remembered the earplugs and how they dimmed even subtle sounds. I sat up and pulled them out. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed unnatural. No mosquitoes, no rustle of breeze through the needles outside, no trickle from the stream a few yards away. It was as if the entire forest had paused mid-breath. I stayed still, listening. The air felt tense, as though waiting for something. Then a faint vibration ran through the wooden floor beneath my hips. At first it was so soft I wondered if it was my imagination or the shifting of the old boards. But then it came again, slightly stronger, a dull rhythmic pulse that traveled up from the ground through the frame of the shelter. It reminded me of footsteps, the weight of something heavy moving slowly, each step spaced far enough apart that I could distinguish one from the next. Too heavy to be a deer, too measured to be any small animal. The vibrations moved toward the back of the lean-to, the side where the wall was lowest to the ground. They stopped almost exactly behind where my head had been a moment earlier. I waited for another step, for something, anything, that would tell me what was out there. Nothing came. The silence returned, deeper than before. That was when I heard the breathing. It wasn't from behind the shelter, where the footsteps had been. This was inside, only a few feet to my left. Slow, steady, and close enough that I could pick out the slight hitch at the top of each inhale. The kind of sound someone makes when they're trying not to breathe loudly, but can't help the natural rhythm of it. The realization that another person was in the shelter with me dropped straight into my stomach like a stone. I didn't move at first. I forced myself to stay as quiet as possible, listening to be sure I wasn't confusing wind with breath. But the breathing continued, faint but unmistakably human, low to the floor and unhurried, as though whoever it was had been lying there for some time. I reached slowly for my headlamp, moving only my right arm. The air felt thick, like each movement pushed through syrup. When my hand closed around the lamp, I angled it without turning it on, trying to plan where to point it. I counted to 3 in my head, took a breath, and switched it on. The beam jumped across the worn floorboards and caught a glint of reflection. 2 eyes, level with the ground, no more than 4 feet away. Not the bright, sharp flash of an animal's eyes, but a dull, human reflection, set in a face that was half hidden by tangled hair. A person was lying there parallel to me, on their side, facing me as if they had been watching me sleep. The moment the full light hit them, they jerked upright with a frantic motion, scrambling to their feet. I saw in that brief second the shape of a soaked shirt clinging to their back, the broad outline of bare arms, the shift of wet fabric around their knees. They bolted straight out the open front of the shelter, the sound of their footsteps slapping against the ground sudden and sharp after so much silence. They disappeared into the tree line in seconds. Not a single word was spoken. I grabbed my bear spray with clumsy hands, knocking over my water bottle in the process. The plastic thud echoed too loudly in the confined space. I stumbled toward the edge of the shelter and jumped down onto the slick rock where the stream flowed past. The beam of my headlamp shook across tree trunks and brush, but found nothing moving, nothing human. Only then did I notice the footprints, dark, wet prints pressed clearly into the smooth rock surface. They led from the shelter to the stream, and then vanished into the undergrowth, heading uphill toward thicker forest. The silence around me had eased slightly, but the insects were still oddly absent. The darkness felt heavy and full of unseen movement, like the woods were trying to close around the space the stranger had just run through. I stood there for several minutes, listening so hard that my ears buzzed from the effort. When the first mosquito finally whined past my cheek, the sound startled me more than it should have. The forest, it seemed, was waking up again. I backed into the shelter and sat on my sleeping bag, bear spray still in my hand. The boards under me felt cooler now, as if the night had finally settled into its full darkness. I kept the headlamp on, sweeping it slowly across every corner of the lean-to. Nothing looked disturbed except for a faint smear of moisture on the floor where the stranger must have been lying. No gear, no bag, nothing left behind. If they had carried anything with them, they had taken it when they ran. I considered packing up and hiking out right then. The trail was clear enough, and my phone had a little battery left, though no service. But the thought of walking alone through dense forest while whoever that person was might be wandering nearby made my skin prickle. The shelter, exposed as it was, still felt like a more defensible spot than the dark trail. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting upright with my back against my pack. Every so often I would switch off my headlamp just to listen. The forest returned to its normal rhythm after a while. The stream trickling softly, insects buzzing in uneven waves, faint rustles drifting from the underbrush. I never heard footsteps again. No more breathing. Just the long, restless stretch of hours until dawn. When daylight finally seeped through the trees, I stepped outside to study the ground more carefully. The wet footprints on the rock had faded, but were still visible enough to trace the direction. They were bare footprints, full length, wide and deep from the moisture that must have been dripping off them. The stride was longer than mine. The impressions veered toward the slope and then disappeared into the ferns, where the soft ground no longer held a clear shape. I searched around the immediate area for any sign of a campsite, a dropped item, anything that would explain who that person was, or why they had approached so quietly in the night. I found nothing. No fire ring, no broken branches, no path cut through the brush. It was as though they had come out of the woods with a specific purpose and gone back without leaving a trace. Before I left, I checked the shelter once more to make sure I hadn't imagined the moisture on the floor. It had dried almost completely, but there was still a faint darkened stripe where their body had been. Kneeling there, I could measure how close they had lain. Barely an arm's length away, positioned directly alongside me, facing me. The sun was rising high enough now to cast light across the clearing, warming the boards of the shelter. The humid air of the previous day had already begun to build again, but the space felt lighter than it had in the hours before dawn. I packed my gear slowly, checking each pocket twice. When I finally shouldered my pack and stepped onto the trail, I felt the weight of the night behind me like a shadow that didn't quite detach. Hiking out, I kept turning the experience over in my mind, trying to make sense of it without inventing anything unrealistic. Someone had approached the shelter on foot, heavy enough to send vibrations up through the boards. They had circled behind it for reasons I couldn't guess, then slipped inside quietly. Maybe they had expected the shelter to be empty. Maybe they were looking for a dry place to sleep and only realized I was there after settling down. Or maybe they had been watching to see whether I woke up. Whatever the intention, the moment my light hit them, they ran as though the only thing that mattered was getting away unseen. By the time I reached the next trail junction, the forest felt normal again. Birds called across the canopy, insects flitted in and out of shafts of sunlight, and the weight of night slowly loosened its grip on my thoughts. But even now, long after that trip, the memory of those quiet footsteps, that silent figure lying so close in the dark, and the wet footprints leading away into the trees has stayed with me far more vividly than any view or summit. Not because it felt supernatural, there was nothing impossible about it, but because it was real in the most basic way. A stranger had come into the shelter where I slept, close enough to touch, without announcing themselves, and left without a word. And the forest, for reasons I still don't understand, had held its breath until they were gone. I was 3 days into a solo backpacking loop in Glacier National Park in late September 2021, and the cold had come in faster than I expected. By the time the sun slid behind the jagged skyline, the temperature seemed to fall in a straight drop, the warmth draining with the light. I had felt it settling over the valley while I filtered water along the edge of Lake Ellen Wilson. The air had gone still, like the whole place was holding its breath before night arrived. I ate a quick dinner, cleaned up, and walked my bare hangout to a solid-looking spruce just uphill from my tent pad. The tree I chose was a little bigger than the others, with branches that started high enough to make a decent hang, so I tied the excess rope to one of my tent lines. It was a habit I'd picked up on solo trips, a way to avoid stumbling around looking for the rope in the dark. By the time I crawled into the tent, the valley had gone completely black. My headlamp beam cut a narrow tunnel through the trees, but the forest outside the circle of light looked bottomless. The park wasn't busy anymore this late in the season. The backcountry permit office told me I'd likely have most camps to myself. I didn't mind that when I booked it, but as I settled into my sleeping bag, the silence wrapped itself tight around the tent. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that pressed against the fabric, waiting for my ears to adjust. I listened to the slow lap of the lake, the small ticks of cooling metal on my stove outside, and the faint crack of ice forming on puddles along the trail. When the last bit of residual warmth in the tent faded, I felt the cold flatten itself against the ground and climb through the foam pad beneath me. I woke sometime around midnight without knowing why. The kind of waking that feels pushed from the outside. At first I thought it was the cold settling deeper into my bones, but then I heard the sound that must have done it. Soft steps in the dirt beside the tent, measured and heavy enough that the ground seemed to compress differently under the weight. Not quick shuffling the way deer move, and not the random snuffling of smaller animals. These steps came in a slow arc, like something was walking a careful circle around the tent. I stayed still because any instinct older than logic told me to. My sleeping bag felt suddenly too loud, the nylon loud against my clothes. The air in the tent felt caught between my chest and my throat. I breathed as quietly as I could, trying not to let the rhythm give anything away. The steps paused, then shifted closer until they stopped right by my head. The thin wall of nylon did nothing to blunt the sound. I could hear claws scraping lightly at the rocky soil, just enough to drag small stones and bits of frost. The breathing came next, low, deliberate, as if whatever stood there was taking slow pulls of the cold night air. Each breath had a damp heaviness to it, something that told me it came from a large chest and wide nostrils. I've camped in grizzly country before, enough to know that the best thing to do when you're in a tent is usually nothing. Just wait, remain calm, and let the animal pass. But this didn't feel like a passing moment. It felt like examination. I could sense the bulk of the animal even without looking. The tent fabric quivered slightly from the force of its breathing. The smell came next, earthy, musky, like wet leaves clinging to thick fur. I didn't hear huffing or agitation, just steady breaths and the occasional faint grind of claws shifting against stone. The bear hang rope was tied to the same tree as my tent line, and a new sound pulled my attention there. A creak, then a quick twang as if someone had tugged sharply on the line. The vibration of the rope carried straight through the tent wall and into the ground beneath me. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it pressing against the sleeping bag. I imagined the bear raising its muzzle toward the suspended bags, smelling whatever traces lingered, even though everything edible had been sealed away. I pictured the rope straining under the weight of the branch, and the thought of the food bags falling near the tent made something cold run through my spine. For a long moment, I lay frozen. The air around my face felt icy, and the tent seemed smaller with every breath I took. My mind tried to measure possibilities, none of them helpful. I knew that staying silent might encourage the animal to keep investigating, but making noise in the dark carried its own risks. Something about the bear's behavior, slow, patient, unbothered, made it more unnerving than if it had been snorting or pacing with agitation. It felt confident, the way an apex animal behaves when it knows nothing nearby can challenge it. I didn't decide to make noise so much as react out of a rising pressure inside my chest. I yelled and slammed my fist against the tent wall near where I heard the breath. The fabric snapped inward then bounced back. The sound felt thin compared to the size of the thing outside. I expected a crash of retreating footsteps, the kind of explosive retreat bears sometimes make when startled. None came. Everything went quiet except for the fading echo of my own heartbeat. The bear didn't run. It didn't even shuffle. It simply stopped moving. That stillness lasted long enough for the cold to creep under my clothing again and settle along my spine. Then the footsteps resumed, slow and unhurried, moving away from the tent. Each footfall grew softer, then blended into the natural sounds of the forest. Eventually even those faded, swallowed by the distance and the thick blanket of the night. When I finally let myself breathe normally, the air felt thin and metallic inside the tent. I didn't sleep again. I watched the faint glow of my watch screen tick minutes onward, the tent walls barely visible in the dim light. Every so often I thought I heard something outside, but it always turned out to be the flap of the tent in the wind or the creak of branches under frost. I lay there waiting for the first sign of dawn, counting every small sound and trying to stay aware without letting panic pull me apart. When the morning light finally seeped through the nylon, it felt like stepping out from underwater. The cold had deepened overnight, and the ground outside was covered with a thin layer of frost that glittered in the pale sun. My breath puffed in front of me as I unzipped the tent. The air smelled sharp and clean, the way it only does at high elevation after a freezing night. The The tracks were the first thing I saw. They weren't old or softened by wind. They were clear, distinct impressions in the frost, each one showing the full arc of claws and the wide pad of a large paw. They circled the tent in a loose loop that tightened near the head of my sleeping area. One print sat so close to the tent wall that a bit of the frost had spread onto the nylon when the bear shifted its weight. The soil beneath that print had been pushed deeper than the rest, showing just how much force the animal carried even while standing still. I followed the tracks a short distance and found the spot where it had stood to investigate the bear hang. The rope was still taut, the bag still suspended high in the branches, but the branch had shifted slightly. A few needles lay scattered on the ground, knocked loose during the bear's examination. Standing there in the brightening morning, I felt the full reality of the night settle in. The bear hadn't been curious in a casual way. It had been studying me, the tent, the smells, and the food. It had taken its time because it had no need to rush. I realized that nothing I did, no amount of preparation or caution, could fully erase the fact that I was a vulnerable intruder in a place where animals far larger and stronger were simply living their lives. I packed slowly, keeping an eye on the surrounding trees, though I didn't see any sign of movement. The tracks led down toward the lake and vanished in a patch of darker soil where the frost had melted. When I finally shouldered my pack and headed back toward the trail, the weight of the night stayed with me. Not as panic, but as a deep respect for the quiet rules of the wild. Out there, the boundary between safety and danger wasn't a line but a shifting space, decided moment by creatures who didn't know or care what humans planned. As I hiked out of the valley, the sun rose higher and warmed the frozen ground. The forest looked calm, almost gentle, but the memory of those slow steps outside the tent stayed sharp. It reminded me that fear in the wilderness isn't always loud or frantic. Sometimes it's the quiet presence of something powerful moving just inches from your face, making decisions in the dark that you can only hope go in your favor. And when dawn finally arrives, the tracks it leaves behind are the only explanation you ever truly get. In April of 2015, I went rock climbing with a partner in Red Rock Canyon in Nevada, and the trip felt like one of those small gambles that you convince yourself will add color to the weekend. We had decided to spend a night out in Icebox Canyon, bivvying at the base of a lesser-used route rather than hiking back to the parking lot. It seemed harmless enough at the time. The days were warm, the forecast looked clear, and the approach had felt empty in that comforting, early spring way when the desert still holds a trace of winter. We figured we would get an early jump on the climb the next morning. The choice didn't feel bold. It felt practical. The sun dropped behind the canyon walls sharply, as if someone had pulled a shade. One moment everything was washed in red and gold, and then suddenly the walls became dark slabs and the temperature began falling fast. By 5:30 the last line of light was gone. By 7 the cold had sharpened in a way that felt more like late November than April. Our breath fogged in the light of our headlamps, and each exhale rose like a thin ghost that dissolved almost immediately in the dry air. My partner crawled into his bivy sack, rustling around for a comfortable position. The canyon quieted in that deep desert way where silence doesn't feel empty but instead pressed close, almost physical. We were camped on a small flat of sand, just above the dry creek bed. The walls on either side stretched up into a narrow piece of sky. A few stubborn juniper bushes clung to cracks in the rocks, dark shapes that looked stunted but persistent. It wasn't a place people lingered unless they were climbing the surrounding routes, and even then, most climbers chose easier approaches. We hadn't seen anyone else all afternoon. I lay inside my bag, listening to the soft wind moving through the brush. The canyon amplified even the smallest sound. Pebbles clicked occasionally as they shifted under cooling rock. A bird made a rough, throaty noise and then settled. My partner's breathing steadied into light snoring. I drifted in and out of a shallow sleep, the kind that breaks at every shift of the air. Around 2 in the morning I woke with a sudden, sharp alertness. No immediate cause, no dream, no physical discomfort, just a sense that something external had pried me awake. It took a moment before I realized I was listening. I wasn't sure what had caught my attention at first. The canyon was still. My partner continued sleeping beside me. Then, under it all, faint and frayed at the edges, I heard what I'd somehow picked up through sleep, a soft sound that I first interpreted as people talking in low voices. I stayed still, letting my breath go quiet, and listened harder. It didn't sound like 2 or more people after all. It was only one voice, but the rhythm shifted constantly. The tone rose and fell, as if whoever it was kept repeating the same short cluster of words, each time in a different pitch or emphasis. The pattern carried a strange, almost mechanical inconsistency, like someone practicing inflection. The quiet made it carry more clearly than I expected. The voice came from the brush near the creek bed, maybe 20 yards away. I lay frozen, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't a place people walked through casually, especially at that hour, and especially not without a light. There was nothing out there, no maintained trail, no campsites, no reason to be crouched in the dark near brittle shrubs and loose stones. I tried to convince myself it could be wind funneling through some oddly shaped rock, or an animal making an unfamiliar sound that my half-asleep brain had reshaped into speech. But the cadence was human, too structured, too repetitive. The longer I listened, the more the meaning formed in my head. I couldn't hear the exact words clearly enough to repeat them, but the pattern was unmistakable. A short command, delivered again and again, each time with a difference in volume or tone. Sometimes it rose into a higher register that pulled lightly through the canyon's stillness. Sometimes it dropped almost to a breath. The repetition was steady, careful, deliberate. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't emotional. It was controlled, as if whoever was out there was rehearsing something or reminding themselves of something. The monotony of it made my skin tighten. I sat up slowly, feeling the sand shift under my elbows. My sleeping bag rustled with what felt like impossible volume. The voice stopped immediately. Every sound in the canyon seemed to collapse into silence. My partner kept snoring, oblivious. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The beam flared across the sand, the dry creek bed, and the low brush. At first I saw nothing but the pale reflection of grit and scattered stones. Then, a few feet beyond the edge of the bushes where the sound had come from, something small caught the light, a muted metallic glint, dull and brownish. I stood, stepped closer, and my beam landed squarely on an old camp stove half buried in the sand. Rust coated it in flakes, like it had been sitting out for years. Beside it lay a crushed aluminum pot, warped and folded in on itself. The items were arranged in a way that suggested someone had left them behind carelessly, maybe even deliberately abandoned them. But what froze me were the marks around them. In the sand were clear impressions of knees pressed deeply into the grit. The shape was unmistakable, two symmetrical indentations side by side, the kind left by someone kneeling for an extended period of time. Behind them, two parallel grooves where feet had been braced, toes dug in. The impressions were crisp, as if they'd been made within the past few hours. The surrounding sand carried no other disturbances. No footprints approaching or leaving, just the kneeling marks in front of the old stove and pot. I backed away slowly, sweeping the light across the bushes, the sandy flats, the canyon walls. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. The air felt heavier than before, not colder, just weighted with the stillness that follows a sound abruptly cut off. I retreated to my sleeping bag, keeping the lamp on for a long time. I considered waking my partner, but nothing I could say felt coherent. The idea of trying to describe a single voice repeating the same phrase in shifting tones felt absurd when surrounded by that relentless silence. Eventually, I turned the lamp off. The dark folded in instantly. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, my partner woke complaining about the cold, brushing sand from his clothes. I didn't mention what I'd heard. I walked back to the spot by the creek bed, expecting that dawn would make everything look harmless. But the stove and pot were still there, and the kneeling marks remained as sharply defined as they had been in the night. The sand surrounding them was untouched. No prints, no drag marks, no disturbed brush. The arrangement looked almost staged. My partner agreed the gear was old and odd, but shrugged it off as trash left by someone long ago. The marks, he suggested, might have been created by an animal. But nothing about them looked like animal impressions. They were human shapes held steady for a long period. We hiked back to the car along the same approach we'd used the day before. When we reached the trailhead, the dust on the road lay untouched except for our own tire tracks from the previous afternoon. No new prints, no bike treads, no signs of any vehicle having arrived during the night. For a long time afterward, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Wind playing tricks in the rocks, or my mind twisting a natural sound into something structured. But the voice had woken me from sleep with a clarity that didn't match a dream. The kneeling impressions didn't match an animal or erosion or chance. Someone had been there in the dark, 20 yards from where we slept, repeating a short phrase in different tones as if testing how it sounded. Whoever it was had stopped the second I moved. There's no supernatural explanation to attach to any of it. Someone, for reasons I can't understand, spent part of that night crouched beside a pile of abandoned gear, rehearsing the same small cluster of words over and over in the cold silence of Icebox Canyon. They left nothing behind but the impressions of their knees. And after I turned on my headlamp, they vanished without leaving a trace in the sand. I've gone climbing many times since, but I've never bivvied again in a place where I can't see every direction around me. In that canyon, on that night, someone else was awake in the dark, and I only heard them because they wanted to be heard, until the moment they didn't. In February 2023, I was winter camping with a friend in Lapland, northern Sweden, a few kilometers off the road near Abisko National Park. The air had that sharp, metallic bite that settles deep into the nose, the kind of cold that turns every exhale into a slow-moving cloud. The snow under our skis made that dry, squeaking sound that only happens far below freezing. We had traveled most of the afternoon, moving steadily over gently rising ground, until we found a small hollow sheltered on two sides by low, stunted birch trees. The place felt still and untouched, as if the cold itself had frozen any trace of movement long before we arrived. We dug a shallow trench for shelter, packing the walls tight, then set up our two tents side by side on the flat section we carved out. The nylon crackled in the cold as we stretched it tight. A lantern hung from a ski pole between the tents, casting a pale circle over the snow. The light reflected off the frozen surface, so brightly that it felt as though we were camping on glass. The silence pressed against my ears in a way I never get used to up north. No running water, no wind, no distant traffic, not even the sound of trees shifting. Just a broad, empty stillness. Temperatures dropped quickly as the last color bled out of the sky. Earlier, faint green aurora streaks had drifted over us, too weak to be dramatic, but strong enough to give the snow a slight tint. I had noticed them while securing the guy lines, thin and wavering like the reflections of distant headlights. By the time we settled in to cook a simple meal on the stove, the sky had gone dark again, leaving only a dense cluster of stars overhead. Everything felt routine, the kind of cold weather camping both of us had done plenty of times. We spoke little, partly because of the temperature, and partly because nothing felt unusual enough to comment on. Around 11:50 p.m., after packing away our gear and shutting down the stove, we turned off the lantern. The sudden return to darkness made the tents feel smaller, like they were being pressed inward by the night. I crawled deep into my sleeping bag and listened to the faint hum of blood in my ears settling into sleep. The snow beneath me was firm, and the layers I had put down earlier insulated well enough that I felt warm almost immediately. Within minutes, the world narrowed to the thin rustle of the sleeping bag fabric and the distant sense of cold beyond the tent walls. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up abruptly without knowing why. The silence I expected was broken. Outside, something moved against the crust of the snow with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was a soft crunching, not the erratic sound of an animal, but something heavier and more uniform. The steps circled both tents at a steady pace. I held still and listened, trying to separate the sound from the thudding of my own heart. Every few seconds, the movement paused, then resumed at the same pace, as though whoever or whatever it was kept stopping to observe. I whispered my friend's name through the tent fabric in the lowest voice I could manage. A moment later, he responded from his tent with the same restrained tone, strained and uneven. I could tell instantly that he was hearing the same noises, and that he was just as unsure as I was about what they meant. The moment he acknowledged it, the crunching stopped, as if the source of the footsteps could sense that we were fully awake. For several seconds, nothing happened. The silence returned so suddenly that it felt unnatural, heavier than before, the kind that makes every small sound inside the tent seem magnified. I strained to hear anything, breathing, shifting snow, branches moving, but there was only stillness. Then, from the direction of my friend's tent, I heard the faint, tentative sound of a zipper being touched from the outside. At first it moved only a few teeth at a time, a slow, testing motion. Then it jerked faster, the pull forcing its way down several centimeters in one motion, like someone trying to get a grip through gloves and growing impatient. I grabbed my headlamp, pushed out of my sleeping bag, and burst through the tent opening into the night air. The cold hit me like a slap, pulling the air from my lungs. My headlamp beam cut across the snow, revealing the small camp we had arranged so neatly the night before. No one was there. The empty space between the tents glowed under the light, undisturbed except for a wide ring of boot prints around both tents. The prints weren't ours. They were deeper and spaced farther apart, the long stride of someone tall, or simply moving quickly. They formed a clear pattern, looping around the tents in uneven circles, as though someone had been pacing while studying them. I moved slowly, sweeping the headlamp beam over the snow. The prints didn't come from the direction of the road, which lay several kilometers behind us. Instead, they appeared from the tree line, emerging from a patch of low birches where the snow was soft and deep. What unsettled me most was how the tracks ended at the same place they appeared. The trees. Beyond the last clear print, the snow lay untouched. Not sunken, not broken, not disturbed at all. My friend stepped out of his tent a moment later, his breath coming in fast white bursts. His zipper had been forced open halfway. We scanned the surroundings over and over, but no movement showed in the birches, and no further sound reached us from the darkness. We sat awake inside our tents until dawn, neither of us willing to lie down again. Each hour felt longer than the one before it. I kept trying to rationalize what we had seen. A local hiker, someone lost, someone curious, someone desperate for help. But nothing made sense. The tracks came from an angle no one would approach while traveling on skis or snowshoes. The spacing was too wide for shuffling or cautious movement, and the abrupt ending of the prints bothered me most of all. Snow that deep should not have supported the weight of a person stepping off the compacted surface. Anyone walking there would have sunken up to the knee. As daylight finally returned, pale and weak, but still enough to lift the darkness, we packed quickly. The cold was less sharp now, softened by the light, but neither of us felt any comfort from it. We followed our own ski tracks back toward the road, glancing behind us far more often than normal. The air stayed calm, and no new prints appeared parallel to our path. When we reached the road, I turned to look back at the stretch of birch trees where the tracks had originated. From that distance, the forest looked thin and harmless, barely tall enough to break the wind. Yet something about the memory of those long strides looping around our tents stayed with me. Something about the confidence implied in walking straight to us in the middle of the night without any sign of hesitation. Only once we were driving away did a clearer explanation form, one that made sense of both the prints and the behavior. In that region during winter, some people travel off-trail on wide backcountry skis designed to stay afloat on deep snow. The tracks around our tents had not been narrow enough for ordinary boots. They had likely been made by someone wearing overboots or insulated gaiters on top of larger touring bindings. The long stride matched that kind of equipment, allowing someone to step over softer pockets without sinking. The reason the tracks ended so abruptly was that whoever had approached had simply turned away at an angle we hadn't followed with our lights, heading back across a patch of fresh snow that we never illuminated and that later hardened with the night's temperature drop, erasing the shallow impressions before we inspected the area. It didn't explain why that person had walked silently into our camp in the middle of the night or what they wanted, but at least it grounded the situation in something human, something possible. Someone had been traveling through the darkness using gear meant for winter forestry or off-trail work, and for reasons we would never learn, had decided to come close, examine our camp, and test the zipper of a tent before leaving again. The cold, the remoteness, and the hour had magnified everything, turning those quiet movements into something far more sinister than they likely were. Even now, the memory still settles into my mind with the same weight it carried that night. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it reminded me how quickly the boundary between solitude and vulnerability can thin in the wilderness, and how, even in the most remote places, you are never as alone as the silence makes you believe. I had been in Patagonia for only a few days when I realized how quickly the place could rearrange my sense of scale. Torres del Paine had a way of making every human sound small. Even the chatter at the refugios felt muted under the pressure of the wind. By the time our group reached the more primitive campsite near Campamento Italiano, I had already grown used to the constant low roar that rolled down from the glacier. It was like living next to an endless ocean swell, always moving, always reminding me that I was an intruder in a landscape shaped by colder and older forces. That night, the third of the trek, a storm had charged through the valley with a violence that made the tent walls bow inward and snap back like stretched rubber. I spent hours with my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, counting the seconds between the gusts, trying not to picture the tent poles folding like straws. By 10, the wind had reached its peak. It wasn't the typical Patagonian howl, but something deeper, the kind of sound that makes the body tense even when the mind insists there's nothing to fear. It rushed down from the glacier in sudden, uneven blasts that rattled cookware and made the ground tremble in short, shivering pulses. I eventually drifted off, exhausted from bracing against the noise. When I woke, it was close to 3 in the morning. What yanked me from sleep wasn't any dramatic crash or snap, but the absence of sound. The wind had cut out with no transition, leaving a complete and unnatural stillness. After hours of chaos, that silence felt wrong. The air outside had the heavy, waiting quality that follows a power outage or a sudden drop in pressure. I lay there for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, trying to decide whether the storm was about to start again or whether it had finished tearing through the valley. That was when I heard the first sound. Fabric tearing. Not the thin flutter of a tent fly catching a stray gust, but a steady, slow rip, like thick material being pulled apart with effort. I froze, thinking my own tent was giving way. I reached up and pushed gently at the wall, feeling the fabric intact under my palm. The tearing came again. It was close, too close, and it wasn't coming from my tent at all. It came from the site next to mine, where a Dutch couple had pitched their small 2-person dome earlier that evening. I remembered them complaining about the cold during dinner, stamping their feet near the cook shelter and rubbing their hands together. They had seemed tired but cheerful, the way people get on long trails when the discomfort becomes part of the rhythm. As I lay there listening, the tearing sound took on a wet undertone, like duct tape being peeled slowly from a damp surface. I tried to make sense of it. A torn rainfly shouldn't sound like that. A failing pole wouldn't either. The silence around the noise made it somehow worse. No footsteps, no shifting gear, nothing human. Just those long, deliberate rips. I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for my headlamp, moving slowly in the tight space so the nylon didn't rustle. I didn't want to call out again. Something about the moment felt fragile, as if any sudden noise would make whatever was happening escalate. Still, after another dragging rip, I couldn't stay still anymore. I unzipped the tent door and let the cold air pour in. The campsite looked different at night. The trees that had seemed comforting during the day now crowded the edges of the clearing, tall silhouettes that swallowed the faint ambient light. The sky above was a dull, cloud-smeared gray. My breath showed in short, pale bursts. I turned my headlamp toward the Dutch couple's site. Their tent was no longer standing. It had collapsed in on itself, the poles bent inward and twisted at angles that didn't look like wind damage. The fly was half peeled back, one corner pinned under a heavy stone, as if someone had weighed it down intentionally. What made every instinct in my body tense were the boot prints. They surrounded the tent in a wide arc, deep impressions in the mud, spaced with the stride of someone large. The prints came straight from the dark line of trees behind the site, circled the tent several times in an irregular pattern, then stopped directly at the collapsed doorway. The couple's own boots were still where they had left them hours earlier, neatly lined up by a flat rock. The laces were still tied. The tongues were still pulled forward. I knew they had gone to sleep wearing only socks. They had complained about cold toes. I stepped toward the tent, trying to scan the surrounding trees without swinging my light too wildly. The mud around my own feet felt soft, holding onto my weight longer than usual. Nothing moved in the trailing. No branches shook. No animals scurried. The stillness held everything in place. When I got close enough to see inside their tent through the collapsed door, the beam from my lamp caught the pale drift of scattered feathers. The sleeping bags had been slashed open lengthwise. Not clawed. Slashed. Clean, intentional cuts. The down inside had spilled out in uneven clumps, sticking to the wet floor of the tent and the fabric of the pads beneath them. I backed away before I realized I was doing it. My legs felt stiff, uncooperative. The prints beside the tent seemed deeper the longer I stared at them, as if the ground had softened under the weight of whoever stood there. The storm hadn't done that. A person had done that. A very large person, alone and silent. I found the guide a few tents over, though the details of crossing the campsite were a blur. When we checked the Dutch couple's tent together, there was no new information except the confirmation of what I had already seen. The sleeping bags cut open, the prints circling, the absence of the couple. The guide swept his light toward the trees several times, searching for movement, but nothing revealed itself. The stillness had settled too deeply for that. We spent the rest of the night half awake, half waiting. None of us said much in the morning when the others emerged from their tents. A few had heard something. Most had slept through everything. The guide left early to radio from a higher point, while the rest of us packed quickly, hands moving faster than our thoughts could keep up. The couple turned up the next afternoon at Refugio Paine Grande. They looked shaken in a way that didn't rely on words. Their base layers were dirty. Their rain jackets were streaked with mud from the night hike. They moved stiffly, as if the cold had soaked into their bones. They said they had crawled out of their tent during the height of the storm to check a loose guy line. And as they did, a large man had stepped out of the trees and tried to push his way inside. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't responded when they tried to get his attention. He had simply leaned onto the tent, pressing his weight into the fabric, trying to widen the opening. They ran. No boots. No packs. They left everything, including their food, their poles, their warm layers, and hiked in the dark by headlamp, following the trail markers until daylight. They said the man never chased them. He just watched them go. The park rangers took statements, asked for descriptions, searched the area. No one found any signs of another hiker, matching what the couple described. No abandoned campsite. No discarded gear. No new tracks. The weather had already started to cover the evidence. The mud froze. The wind erased what hadn't sunk deeply enough to hold. For the rest of the trek, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence of that night had been the real warning, not the storm. The valley had gone still, so I could hear something I wasn't meant to sleep through, something human that didn't fit the landscape any more than I did. Even now, when I think back on it, what unsettles me most isn't the prints, or the slashed sleeping bags, or the collapsed tent. It's the idea of a man walking through that forest in the middle of the night without a light, without a word, moving with purpose toward a stranger's shelter, driven by something that had nothing to do with need or desperation, just intent, and the knowledge that he moved on quietly after that night, slipping back into the trees with the same silence that woke me, leaving only those deep impressions in the mud to prove he had ever been there. In January 2020, I was working as a survey tech in the Tongass National Forest, living out of a canvas wall tent that sagged with cold rain most days. The camp was half a mile off a logging road, nothing more than a muddy track cut into the hills. I had been out there for weeks, long enough for the steady drizzle to feel like part of my own pulse. By late afternoon it was always dark, and the kind of darkness that didn't sit still, shifting with the wind, pulsing with the rise and fall of the rain. That night I was alone. My partner had taken the crew boat back to town, and I was supposed to break camp in the morning, hike out, and meet a new crew on the other side of the island. I'd done it enough times that the loneliness didn't bother me much, but I still felt the absence of another person's breathing once everything settled for the night. I remember how the rain sounded that evening, a soft, fine hiss that coated the tent and filtered through the trees. I cooked a freeze-dried dinner on the tiny stove, ate half of it, and let the rest sit because the thought of hot food had been better than the reality. Everything smelled faintly of wet canvas, damp wool, and the metallic bite of the stove fuel. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I looped the zipper pulls through a small carabiner, same as always. It was routine by then, almost automatic. Something about knowing the zipper couldn't be tugged open by the wind, or anything else, helped me sleep out there. The forest felt heavy that night. Not dangerous, just weighted. Every drip from the fly sounded louder, and the gusts of wind pushed the tree branches into slow, creaking movements. I drifted in and out at first, the way you do when your body is tired but your mind still listens for things. The tent snapped slightly in the wind, then relaxed again. The creek nearby rushed at a steady pace, swollen from the winter storms. I must have fallen fully asleep around 10, because after that I didn't remember anything until the moment I woke up. It was sometime after midnight when I opened my eyes. There was no reason for it at first, just that strange sense of being pulled awake. Then I heard it, the long, deliberate sound of a tent zipper being opened. It wasn't faint or distorted, it was sharp, right next to my ear. My brain tried to slot the sound into something familiar, but it didn't fit. My own zipper was locked with the carabiner. There was no one else out there. I lay completely still, listening, and for a moment, all the noises of the forest seemed to fold inward. The rain felt farther away. The wind stopped rattling the canvas. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat thudding in my neck. Then the zipper sound came again. Slow, intentional, inches away through the thin canvas wall. Every hair on my arms lifted. I remember realizing that I wasn't breathing, and then forcing a breath in, quiet enough that it didn't feel like a giveaway. My hand moved toward my headlamp in the dark, and even that tiny motion felt too loud, like my sleeping bag was made of crinkling paper instead of fabric. I fumbled for the switch with fingers that suddenly felt thick and useless. A moment later, I heard a man's whisper. Low, right outside the fabric door. 2 words, but too soft to mistake. It wasn't wind. It wasn't imagination born of isolation. It was a voice placed with deliberate closeness, as if whoever it was had leaned toward the zipper when they said it. My whole body locked up. I kept telling myself the zipper was still clipped shut. The carabiner was right there. Whoever was on the other side couldn't open it quietly. That small fact felt like the only thing keeping me from freezing in panic. I turned on the headlamp and pointed it at the door. The beam landed on the canvas, pale and blank. The zipper was exactly where I'd left it, the silver carabiner still latched through the pulls. Nothing had moved. The door hadn't even flexed as if someone had tugged it, but on the far side of the wall, close enough that I could track each motion, I heard heavy boots sloshing through mud. They weren't running. They weren't hesitant. The stride was slow, even almost relaxed. Water splashed under each step, the sound sharp in the cold air. Whoever it was moved away from the tent, heading back toward the direction of the road. I didn't chase the sound. I didn't even unzip the door. I stayed exactly where I was, with the headlamp beam fixed on the zipper that hadn't moved, and listened until the steps faded into the rain. For a long time after that, I just sat upright in my sleeping bag, staring at the door, waiting for the steps to return. My ears strained for everything: the creak, the wind, the quiet drip off the tarp. Every noise felt like it might be something else in disguise. Eventually, the forest returned to its normal rhythm. The rain softened back into its steady hiss. The air settled. The trees creaked in the breeze again. Nothing else out of place. I didn't sleep. Instead, I kept the headlamp on until the battery warning flicked, then switched to the backup. Dawn in winter arrived slowly, almost grudgingly, and when the light outside finally shifted from black to a dim, colorless gray, it felt like I'd been waiting for days. I unlatched the carabiner, unzipped the door, and stepped out into the soaked clearing. The cold air hit my face hard, metallic and clean. The ground was thick with mud, churned from weeks of rain, but something new stood out immediately. Fresh boot prints. Not mine. Not my partner's. Not any of the crew's. None of them had been anywhere near the tent the night before. These prints came straight from the direction of the logging road, cutting through the saturated moss and silt with a clear, deep tread. They stopped right in front of the tent door, exactly where the sounds had come from. Then, instead of going back toward the road, they turned sharply and headed into the trees, away from any trail. The direction didn't make sense. It led deeper into the forest, toward thick undergrowth that no one would choose to walk through unless they knew it well, or didn't care what waited inside. I crouched beside the prints, staring at the way the edges held their shape. They were hours old at most. The rain hadn't washed them out yet, which meant whoever had been there didn't linger long after I heard them walk away. I looked toward the trees, half expecting to see movement, but there was nothing except branches dripping from the night's storm. My pulse still hadn't settled. Every muscle felt ready to sprint, but the forest stayed still. Packing up took twice as long as usual. Every zipper, every snap, every rustle of fabric made me twitch. I kept stopping to listen, to make sure the only steps I heard were my own. When I finally shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I avoided stepping on the prints. They felt like evidence of something I didn't want to disturb. The hike back to the road was short, but it felt much longer. The trees formed tight walls on either side, and the undergrowth pressed close, dripping water onto the back of my neck every time I brushed past a branch. The logging road looked the same as always, quiet, slick with rain, empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring down its length, listening for any sign of another person. There was nothing but the soft rumble of distant water. When I made it to the pickup point, the crew boat arrived on schedule. The others asked how the night went, but I didn't tell them much. I said it was fine. Cold. Uneventful. The truth felt too strange to say out loud. Even now, the part that sits with me the most isn't the whisper or the boots walking away. It's the quiet confidence in those steps, the way they didn't hesitate, the way they didn't try to hide. Whoever it was had walked straight to my tent in the middle of the night, stood close enough to make sure I woke up, and then left without rushing. They didn't want anything from me. They just wanted me to know they were there. And in a place as vast and empty as the Tongass, that was enough to change the way the forest felt long after I left it. I had not thought much about that trip in years, but whenever I picture the bend of the Kananaskis River just off Highway 40, I still remember the exact smell of the place. The air had that crisp late summer sharpness, as if the first hints of autumn were moving through the trees long before anyone admitted the season was changing. In August 2017, a few friends and I camped along a narrow bank that lay below the road, tucked among aspens and scattered spruce. We'd chosen it because it took a short scramble to reach and felt isolated enough that we couldn't see car lights or hear more than a faint wash of tire noise. The river did most of the talking anyway, rushing through bends lined with rounded stones polished by decades of cold water. It was the kind of spot that felt safe without being cozy, a place where you knew nature was in charge but didn't mind sharing the space. We'd spent the evening building a small fire and watching it shift between orange and deep red as the sun pulled away from the valley. The wind had remained soft until around 11, then picked up in short bursts that made the aspen leaves snap like small pieces of foil. We put the fire out earlier than planned because sparks had started to drift toward a tangle of dry grass near the shore. Once the heat faded and the last glow sank into the stones, the darkness felt thicker than it should have. My sleeping bag still carried the scent of campfire smoke, and for a while that comforted me, though the wind continued moving through the branches above our tents with uneven gusts that made the fabric tremble. Sometime later, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud enough to jolt me upright, but it pulled me out of the shallow, restless sleep I usually fell into outdoors. When I checked my watch, its faint green numbers read 3:12 a.m. The wind seemed to have paused, leaving the air strangely hollow. The river filled the gap with a steady rush, but underneath it I could hear something else. It repeated at slow intervals, steady enough to catch a pattern. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to stay still for a moment before reacting, as if moving too quickly would draw attention from whatever was producing the sound. After a few breaths, I unzipped a small corner of my tent door, just enough to let in the cold air and a strip of moonlight. I held my breath and listened. The noise came from the riverbank, not far from where we had climbed down earlier. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across stones, the rounded kind that shift and clack when weight moves over them. There would be a low scrape, a short pause, then a dull drop, followed by silence before it began again. Drag, drop, drag, drop. The spacing between each sequence made it feel deliberate. At one point, I heard the faint splash of water and a muffled grunt, the sort someone might make while adjusting their footing under a heavy load. I whispered my friend's name toward the tent beside mine, but the only response was the river and the small scratch of leaves brushing against my tent. The unease that had been hovering at the edge of my thoughts edged closer. I tried to talk myself down by imagining simple explanations. Maybe one of my friends had woken up to use the river as a bathroom and slipped on the stones, but no one had unzipped their tent. I would have heard it. The sound was not a stumble or a brief accident. It continued in a slow, purposeful rhythm. I crawled out of my tent as quietly as I could, careful not to let the zipper echo in the stillness. The air felt colder than it had earlier, and my fingers stiffened as I fumbled for my headlamp. I clicked it on and pointed the beam toward the river. The light caught flashes of pale stones, wet driftwood, and a few tall grasses moving in the low breeze. Then it landed on something bright and out of place, a blue dry bag lying half in the water and half on the stones. I didn't recognize it. None of us owned anything that color. Its position looked odd, as if it had been tugged partway up from the river, but never fully retrieved. I waited for movement, expecting to see someone nearby, but the riverbank stayed still except for ripples passing around the bag. I swept the beam higher, scanning the tree-line and the small openings between the trunks. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by the constant rush of water. I stood there for several minutes, listening for anything that broke the pattern, but the night had gone quiet again. The cold started to bite through my thin shirt, and I realized I couldn't stand out there forever. I backed away slowly, making sure I didn't trip over the roots or low brush. Once inside my tent, I left the headlamp off and stayed awake with my eyes open, watching the faint fabric glow each time the moon shifted behind thin clouds. I could still hear the river clearly, but the dragging never returned. It took a long time for sleep to return, and when it did, it came in short bursts broken by the slightest noise. Morning light arrived with a pale, washed-out quality. The others stirred at their usual pace, unaware that anything had happened. As soon as I stepped out, I looked toward the river. The blue dry bag was gone. It hadn't floated downstream, I would have seen it caught on the cluster of logs near the next bend. I walked to the spot where I had seen it. On a flat rock at the edge of the shore, there were faint drag marks carved into the thin film of silt and algae. A smear of something dark brown streaked the surface. It wasn't fresh enough to be red, but it had soaked into the stone in a way that suggested it hadn't been there the day before. I didn't say anything to my friends right away. Part of me wondered if I had been half dreaming or misinterpreting shadows and sounds in the dark. But the marks on the rock were real, and the absence of the bag nagged at me. As we packed up camp, I kept glancing toward the river, expecting something to surface or drift by that would tie the night together in a logical way. When we drove out along Highway 40, we passed a small RCMP truck near the main campground. An officer stood by the tailgate, speaking to someone who looked like a park worker. I didn't think much of it until later, when the radio mentioned a search underway for a missing kayaker who hadn't checked in for 2 days. They described the kayak as a bright color, though they didn't mention the rest of the gear. I felt a slow tightness form in my chest as I pictured the blue dry bag again, half submerged, as if someone had tried to pull it ashore but hadn't finished the job. The explanation that settled over me wasn't dramatic, but it left a deeper impression than any supernatural story could. Someone had likely struggled in that river before we arrived, maybe overturned or caught in one of the stronger eddies upstream. Their gear might have drifted until it reached our section of the bank. The dragging sounds I heard could have been the current shifting the bag or another piece of equipment against the stones, making it seem as though a person was moving it. The muffled grunt might have been nothing more than water pushing against debris, echoing strangely through the tight bend of the shore. The dark smear on the rock could have been from something organic the river carried along, staining whatever surface it touched. By morning, the river had probably pulled everything back into its current, hiding the evidence as easily as it revealed it. What I had witnessed was not haunting or mysterious, just the quiet, indifferent mechanics of nature moving something heavier than it could hold in one place. I think about that night more often than I admit. The memory is clear not because anything supernatural happened, but because it reminded me how small and unprepared I was in a landscape that didn't care whether I understood what I saw or heard. It taught me that fear can surface even when the truth is entirely believable. And whenever I drive that stretch of Highway 40 now, I can't help scanning the river, imagining the moments before and after the sounds that woke me, and recognizing how little I really witnessed of someone else's tragedy as it passed briefly through the darkness near our camp.